Hello everyone. We're doing this a bit differently today since we had some tech issues with the presentation. So the format will be slightly different, but hopefully it will work for everyone, the screen format. So I will let our guests introduce themselves.
Okay, well, first of all, thanks, Valerie, for inviting us. We are really excited to be here. I am Carolina Baruzzi. I am a postdoctoral associate in the Crandall Fire Lab at the University of Florida. And I'm also very excited to be here because I'm with my friend and collaborator, Jen Phil.
I'm also a postdoc in the Crandall Fire Ecology Lab at the University of Florida. And yeah, we're super excited to talk to you about what we study and what we think about pretty much every day.
Yeah, okay.
Awesome.
So we can go to the next slide. And we decided to start this presentation with the Lion King because we thought it a good way to kind of attract your attention, but also because we are going to be talking a lot about savannas. And usually when people think about savanna, we think about like the most iconic example probably of savannas, which is the African savannas. And savannas are actually present not just in Africa, but also in the United States. In fact, those habitats are constituted by sparse trees and a continuous herbaceous layer that are predominantly made by grasses. So that's a type of habitat that, again, we also have here in the United States, although it's kind of different to the picture that you're seeing here that is likely what most people imagine. So this figure here is a picture of a long-leaf pine savanna. And as you can see, pines are pretty sparse and we have a pretty consistent herbaceous layer in the understory, which is made by grasses. This picture was taken at the Ordway Fisher Biological Station, which is also one of the study area where we conduct most of our research. So you are gonna be hearing, a lot of our experiments today, and the experiment we're going to be talking about today, most of them come from these and a couple of other areas. So the areas that you can see here in the map are our primary research site. And we just very briefly wanted to show you a map of our research site because, first of all, we thought it was interesting, especially for the folks around Florida, to know where the areas that we are going to be talking about are, but also because pine savannas are actually all over the southeast of the United States. And we all wanted to point out that our research focused primarily on pine savannas in Florida.
So, savannas aren't just plants, they burn very frequently. And so we come to the stars of the show, which are our bunchgrasses, our fundamental fuels. And without them, pine savannas really wouldn't burn. So these grasses are really kind of a defining feature of savannas, and especially of the pine savannas we're talking about. They are super flammable and they burn really easily. These photos we took at a fire in Austin Carey Forest, one of the
well, I can, do you want me to go ahead and, okay. So she's gonna come back. I'm sure she's gonna come back at a certain point. But yeah, so she was saying bunch grasses are extremely flammable, and so these pictures that you can see here have been taken from a fire that we did at the Austin Carey Forest, and as you can see, almost all the grass layer is consumed. And I think what Jen wanted to say.
I'm back.
Okay, nice.
Sorry about that. So they burn really easily and quickly, and that's why pine savannas can burn really frequently, on the order of every 2 to 3 years. So next slide. So here I'm showing you that bunch grasses are they drive a fuel fire cycle, what we call a fuel fire cycle, where the fuels catch fire, they burn, fuels reaccumulate, and then that promotes that cycle of very frequent fire, which is really important. Now, next slide, when you break that cycle and you exclude fire from pine savannas, litter accumulates, shrubs grow bigger, and there isn't a whole lot of light that the grasses need to grow. And so you lose that fundamental fuel component that defines savannas. And what you have isn't really much of a savanna at all. So next slide, you can see that when you compare it to the picture that we showed you earlier, where there is so much grass in the ground layer, but if you take fire out, you lose the grasses. Next slide.
Okay, so one of the most important messages that we wanted to send, and I'm sure that many people at the Florida Native Plant Society already are aware of that, is that fire, it's actually beneficial for most plants in fire-frequented systems. Although many people think that fire is in general bad for nature. In fact, like one of the first months I was here, I did a prescribed burn in one of my study sites. And I remember I sent a short video to a friend that the video was showing me with a drip torch setting some grasses on fire. And I remember my friend was completely shocked because she thought I was doing something terrible for nature. But the truth is that most plants again need fire, and they are also not killed by fire. They are very often just top killed. For example, in the picture that you can see, the top picture there shows some grasses, some bunch grasses regrowing just a few days after fire. And in the other picture, you can see the one on the right is showing some palmetto that was, I think that picture was taken just a few days after fire. And the palmetto wasn't even completely top killed. So we really wanted to share this picture to give the message that again, fire is not negative for plants in fire frequency system, and it can promote, biodiversity and plants in general in these systems.
So another question that comes up about fire, not only is it good or bad, when do they usually happen? The timing of fire is actually really interesting in these systems, as some of you are probably familiar with, because many plants depend on fire, and fires at different times of the year can elicit different responses from plants. They have different relationships with fire at certain times of the year. So for example, fires at one time of the year might stimulate certain plants to flower as opposed to fires at other times of the year. So next slide. We like to think of, 4 seasons in the year. And so from a temperature standpoint, that might work, although some people in Florida might disagree with that. But in terms of fire, ecologically speaking, we can think of it in terms of 2 seasons, a wet season and a dry season. And what that means is during the dry season, you have less rainfall. During the wet season, you have more rainfall. So on this graph, on the x-axis, you can see the first letter of the months of the year, starting in January. And what this line represents rainfall. So when the line is going down, that means you're getting less rainfall. When the line is going up, you're getting more rainfall. And so periods of time where you're getting less rainfall, that's what we would call the dry season. And periods of time where you're getting increasing rainfall is the wet season. So the dry season usually happens if you find, October, November there towards the middle of the graph. The dry season, things start to dry out towards the end of the year. So October, November, December, January, February, you're getting less rainfall. And then it bottoms out kind of around April, May, June, that lower line there. So next slide, that's where it's usually the driest. And what that means is around that time of year, if you get an ignition, you're most likely to have a fire. Now, as I mentioned before, because fuels, these grasses just are like tinder. They dry out so quickly. You could get a fire really at any time of the year, but typically, because of weather conditions, you would be most likely to get a fire around this time of year if there was an ignition. So next slide. So we come to our key player here, one of them. This is wiregrass. It's pretty well-known grass, Aristida bereciana in the south, and there's more north in northern South Carolina and North Carolina. We call it Aristida stricta. But it's wiregrass, very commonly known. It's a bunchgrass, and it burns very easily, and it's typically stimulated to flower after fire. So you won't really see it producing flowering stems unless it's been burned, which is a really cool aspect of this plant. And as I mentioned before, with the fuel fire cycle, these bunchgrasses grow back very, very quickly after fire. So we were like, how quickly do they grow back? Because you hear people talk about it all the time. They're like, oh yeah, you burn and then the plants grow back. So we were like, we're actually going to measure this thing. So we went out to an area of one of our sites that burned in January. That's the winter fire. And kind of like middle of the dry season or beginning of the dry season. And we went out to a site that had burned in summer, June, which is kind of in the wet season. And they burned, and about every week to every 2 weeks, we measured the lengths of the leaves on wiregrass. And you can see here where the lines kind of start to plateau. For summer, that was within, say, 3 months. And for the winter, it was about 6 months. So these plants reached their maximum leaf length within about 6 months of fire, which means that, and I've heard, and some of you may also have heard, that sometimes pine savannas can burn twice in a year because these fuels come back so quickly. So next slide. You can see that here in these photos, if you don't burn wiregrass, there's a period of time where it just keeps accumulating. So you get this thick mat. We showed you that picture before where fire was excluded. So if it doesn't burn for a really long time, that photo had been a site without fire for about 50 years. If you don't burn for that long, the grass just sort of starts to shade itself out and the buds go dormant or they die. And so then you start to lose the grass. But for a short period of time after, you have where you still have some light, the grass keeps growing and it gets thicker. And then you have this mat. And then fire comes along, gives the grass a haircut, starts growing back really quickly. And then about 6 months after fire, it'll flower. So next slide.
Okay, and flowering is also affected by the season where wiregrass can be burned. In fact, wiregrass is known for typically produce more inflorescences where when it's burned during the spring or the summer. And it's also one of the research area that our lab focus on. However, next slide, sorry. However, the number of flowering cones, so inflorescences produced, is not the only factor that can affect reproduction, and especially the response to fire season of reproduction. In fact, in one of our studies, we investigated the response of the seed quality depending on the season where wiregrass was burned. We burned plants during winter, spring, and summer, and we showed that although the plants that were burned during the spring produce more inflorescences, the quality of the seeds, so the large majority of seeds that germinated was actually from the plants that were burned during the summer. So we thought this was very interesting, and also one of the most interesting part of this study is that we didn't just look at burn season, but we also looked at canopy cover. So within each season, so when plants were burned during the winter, during the spring, or during the summer, we also selected area with different levels of canopy cover. And we saw that when plants were burned during the summer, they produce more seeds, and the seeds germinated more where the plants were in higher canopy, which is something that for us, like for me, it was extremely interesting because as Jen has mentioned earlier, like wiregrass and in general grasses need sunlight, and they generally do very well when you have a lot of sunlight. So for us, it was extremely interesting seeing that actually reproduction in some instances can be actually promoted where you have a higher canopy cover. It's also something that we are going to explore in future research, because although we found that pattern, we're still not sure about the exact mechanisms. But we think it's really important because it shows not just that the burn season where the plants get burned that can affect reproduction, but also that microsite conditions are very important for wiregrass reproduction.
Okay, so we talked about how season could affect wiregrass reproduction, and that's often something that people are concerned about because we light prescribed fires in the Southeast. Some of you are probably familiar with that, and to try to keep these systems healthy and promote wiregrass flowering. But another aspect of fire is how often it happens. And so we know that fire is good and it's healthy. We know that they can burn really frequently. And we know that without fire, the plants shrink. They don't do that well, and they're not producing seed. So at Austin Cary Forest, we have a few sites. We have one site where, as I mentioned before, wiregrass is burned every single year. And we have another site where wiregrass has been burned about every 2 to 3 years. And so in the fall, when wiregrass produces its flowering stems, we collect seeds for germination experiments and whatever else we have going on in the lab. So what we've noticed is that in the site where where they've been burning it every 2 to 3 years, the seeds look great. These flowering stems are chock full of seeds, and the seeds are filled, which means that there is actually something in that seed capsule. But when we were collecting seeds in the annual fire unit, there really wasn't that much in the seed. When we went to pull off the seeds from the flowering stems, they kind of disintegrated in our hands. There were some seeds, but not nearly as many in the site that was burned less frequently. And we don't know why that is. We don't know the mechanism. One of our ideas is that the plants just don't have enough resources to put into seeds because they're being burned, and then they're like, okay, we're getting ready to go again, and then they get burned again. Another thought is that perhaps it has something to do with the buds, the bud physiology. Maybe the buds do need some kind of recovery time for to mature into flowering stems, like healthy flowering stems. So we're not sure what that mechanism is, but we found it really interesting that burning every year caused such a dramatic difference. Next slide. So another really interesting question was, well, okay, so what happens if you have an area, which often happens, that you can't burn frequently, or that just hasn't been burned frequently enough? And so something like that unit where there hadn't been any fire in 50 years. So the plants are really small. They're still there. You can see in the picture on the right with the yellow circles, that's wiregrass hiding there under the pine needles. And if you burn it, is it going to flower, or is it just too lost? It just hasn't had fire for so long that it can't even reproduce. So this picture is in a unit that hadn't had fire in 30 years. And so we tagged plants, we put little individual numbered tags next to the plants, and we burned it. And next slide, surprise, surprise, wiregrass did what it usually does, and it grew back, the plants grew back, and they produced seeds that germinated. Very, very, very cool to know that, you know, especially for restoration, that, you know, even if you have an area that still has wiregrass hanging on, it will still respond to fire. It's still alive. It's still there, and there's hope. So that was very, very cool. Next slide. Another cool thing is that even very, very young plants can flower and produce seed. So at our other site, we have three, at one of the sites on the map, we have another 3 units, and they've recently started restoring those areas. And so when we started this study, we looked at plants that have been growing for 1 year, 2 year, and 3 years. And interestingly enough, when those plants were burned, they produced flowering stems, so even a year old. They produced flowering stems, and they produced seed that germinated. And not only did they produce good seed, but in this case, those plants, they produced a greater proportion of those seeds germinated than even our other older plants at our other sites. So we've heard this from other people too, other folks who have been doing restoration, that it seems that young plants have almost in many cases even better seed, or you have a better chance of getting really good seed from younger plants, which is great, because if you're starting to restore a pine savanna, even with young plants, they can still produce really good seed. You don't have to wait, 10 years to start getting seeds from them. Next slide.
Okay, so something that we have not mentioned yet is that pine savannas are extremely diverse. In fact, they are considered a biodiversity hotspot. So part of our research focuses on trying to understand the effects of bunchgrasses on this high biodiversity that we find in pine savannas. Next slide. Okay, so we have already introduced wiregrass, which is one of the main stars of our research program. We also study our other bunch grasses, and specifically here I want to talk about dropseed, because dropseed, as you can probably see from the picture in there, it's extremely similar to wiregrass. So when it doesn't flower or produce seeds that you can see in the smaller picture, they are extremely similar. I cannot tell you how many times, especially as soon as I started my research here in Florida, I went to the field and I misidentified the dropseed for wiregrass. So they are not just very similar, but also from a functional standpoint, they have a very similar functional role because they both carry fire. But one of the things we are interested in is looking at whether they can associate with different plants, because although they are very similar, both functionally and for how they look like, they may associate with different plants, and so they can promote biodiversity in different ways. So next slide. And okay, this slide is just a funny slide. We just really wanted to promote dropseed here because wiregrass is the most famous bunchgrass, is the one that is most known, likely because usually is the one that is targeted for restoration. And although it's very important, we agree on that. We love wiregrass. We study a lot of aspects of the wiregrass biological cycle, but we also really love other bunch grasses, and we think they are really important and they should be considered when we study the ecology of pine savannas. Next slide. In fact, one of the experiments that we carried out, it was very important for us to kind of show how wiregrass and dropseed specifically can promote biodiversity in pine savannas. In fact, we found out that the species richness, so the number of different species that we usually find in the proximity of the two bunchgrass species is the same. So we try to represent here in the graph here, like with the balls of different colors, different plant species. And as you can see, we have more or less the same number of balls, but some of the colors are different, which represent what we found, because we found that there are some understory plant species that generally tend to occur with one species or the other. So in our plant surveys, we found some species that just occurred in wiregrass proximity and others that just occurred in the proximity of dropseed. Next slide. So if we talk about community level interactions, we have to consider that a good portion of the plant biomass is actually below ground. So we are very interested in investigating the effect between, here I'm going to be specifically talking about wiregrass, so the effect of wiregrass and the below ground component of the community that we can find in pine savannas. Next slide. And one of the reasons because we are particularly interested in those interactions is because when we talk with managers and when we hear about restoration, we hear that it's generally advised to source wiregrass from a similar soil. For example, usually we talk about wet and dry soils here in Florida, and we have plants that tend to, like population that live in more wet or dry pine savannas. So we did an experiment where we planted seeds from wiregrass plants that were growing in wet and dry pine savannas. And we planted them in both wet and dry soil. And we want to see how they perform, so how much they grow and how much biomass they produce. Next slide. So what we found was that the seeds coming from the wiregrass growing in dry soil was actually not performing very well when it was growing in wet soil, which is something that to us was kind of counterintuitive. And it's probably the beauty of science where you find the results that you don't expect. Because personally, before studying this experiment, I thought that likely a plant that was used to grow in more dry soil was going to do much better, right? Was going to be like, oh, okay, here, I finally have a lot of water, I can grow more. Instead, it was actually the opposite. We found those plants to grow less. We set up the experiment in a way that we were kind of able to partition and identify the effects of soil nutrients and the soil biota. And we specifically found that those dry seeds growing in wet soil were likely negatively affected by the biota in the wet soil. So we are also going to be doing more research to kind of try to detangle the mechanism and see what was exactly going on. But we thought it was very interesting, and it also confirms what we have heard about the importance of sourcing wiregrass from a site with a similar hydrology.
So what is our next step? We've learned so much about these grasses over time and through different experiments. And our next step in our lab is to bring a lot of that to an actual restoration site, only we're going to do it in an experimental way. So over the last year, we've been working on setting up a big field experiment where we'll be getting seeds from dry soils and wet soils and planting them out in the field, taking this out of the lab and actually starting our own big project where we can follow individual plants and see how they do. while we look at all the different things that could be affecting, their performance, fire, the soil, you name it. And we're really, really excited. We're going to be sharing our updates we have the link to our blog on Wiregrass and Dropseed. I know we call it a Wiregrass blog, but Dropseed is also featured there. And so we encourage you to check back frequently on that and see what we're doing, share your stories, share your experiences, ask questions. We really want this to be a collaborative learning experiment. So please do check that out. Next slide. We have a lot of people to thank for all of the things that we've talked with you about today, and members of our lab, students, landowners, faculty at UF. We can't even begin our funding sources, of course, because nothing's possible without money. So, so yeah, thank you so much. And last slide. Thanks for your attention, and we welcome your questions. We have our contact information there if you want to get a hold of us and ask us any questions or share stories or anything. So thank you so much.
My volume on so people can hear me. Okay, and I'm going to switch back to all of us. View, show self view, gallery. Okay, I'm back. Okay, so far we just have we have this nice discussion with Eugene Kelly and Wendell Cropper. So Eugene says he's our policy and legislation chair. If you didn't know, he's a minor celebrity. He just got a op-ed published on the front page of the Tampa Bay Times coming Sunday.
Oh, congratulations.
About the manatees and how, they eat native seagrass. And so, we pollute the water and you don't see the native seagrass, kills it. And then the manatees don't have anything to eat. So anyways, okay. So he says, technically pine savanna could be considered an oxymoron or contradiction in terms because savanna is a general term for a tropical or subtropical grassland. And pine implies forest, which I kind of got on him for, because I don't think so. He says, but it's not an oxymoron because the grasses and the fires they promote are more fundamentally definitive of the community than the pines, right? I mean, that's accurate. And then he says, at least that's my take on the apparent contradiction why savanna is so appropriate. But then Wendell Cropper with UF Forestry pops in. Savannas always have trees. They're not closed canopies, forests, or prairies. They are oak savannas, pine savannas, and other species around the world.
Yeah.
So no, it's okay. No, I tend to agree with Dr. Cropper, with Wendell, because both made very good points, and I also agree that one of the main feature of savannas are grasses, right? So if you have a dense understory mainly dominated by grasses and those sparse trees, I think it's legitimate calling it a savanna. But yeah, Jen, what do you think? Jen is also the one who's studying this.
I've gone back and forth in this, and researchers published papers. There are published papers that I came across one that went pages and pages on different definitions for a savanna. So I think the thing that it comes back to most frequently from what I've seen is, yes, you have to have the grasses in the ground layer. You have to have that ground cover of C4 grasses. Canopy cover, if you want to get into percentages of canopy cover, that's also kind of, another thing. And then, the presence of a mid-story. I think those three components, people kind of vary on, what their parameters are for whether it's a savanna or a forest or a woodland or, any number of terms. But I do think that the grasses are the number one defining feature of a savanna. And then you also very, very hard on its heels is the canopy cover, the level of canopy cover that you have, which is related to, whether you have grass or not. So yeah, it's a good discussion. It's a semantic one that you could go down a rabbit hole for forever.
Well, to me, this reminds me a lot of the discussion we've had on here in the past. I mean, Lunch and Learns, in that, do you call native plants invasive if they are invading an ecosystem? And so I think we're talking about, okay, people like Jean and myself and people who are talking to people buying plants from Lowe's. It's very important to be able to say that native plants are not invasive. right? Because then you can say, no, 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 that's not invasive. Only, exotic plants, don't go to Lowe's, right? And so as a person who's trying to I'm trying to save a forest myself. Now it's more of a savanna, but a lot of people who live in Florida have a more positive connotation with saving the forest and saving the trees. And so thus a lot of people, I think in Florida, when you're trying to talk about habitats, you want to use the most positive term possible. And our Florida savannas, people are like, we don't have any giraffes or anything.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I agree. I think that, and I have used the term forest for savannas because that's what people know. It kind of depends on your audience, what comes to mind. So I guess, scientifically speaking, it would be a savanna, and, ecologically speaking, they function like savannas, but a lot of people are familiar with, the pine forests, and they might not be thinking of just a dense, grove of trees. They might be thinking of a savanna, but to them, that's the term they have. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think, as Jen said, it really depends on your audience, because, for example, I'm used to upland forests. So when I hear forest, I immediately think about an environment that is mainly light limited, has canopy, it's very thick and dense. So yeah, but because I come from a place where we have a lot of this upland hardwood forest, and I don't think, I may be wrong, but I don't think we have savannas in Italy. So that's why for me it's very natural, this distinction. But I also agree that if you are used to something different, it's probably you probably think about forest that in a different way.
We have some questions. Michael Adler popped in, I would say about mid-presentation, and said it looks like that site has some centipede grass issues.
Which one?
Which one?
I'm not sure. It was right before, I think, your wiregrass, you showed the burn picture of the wiregrass.
Let me see.
Yeah, let me see.
I can go back online.
There are some sites where we have centipede grass issues, especially the one that we are trying to restore, the one where we showed the last picture. It was definitely a concern.
Yeah. Yeah, these are not pristine sites that we're showing pictures of. So yeah, definitely there are other plants in there that you might wish were not.
Wendell asks, how long does a wiregrass plant live?
I wish I could tell you. That's about all I can say. I mean, they've tried estimating it by, okay, so if the plant grows this much per year, then how big is it? So how old is it? But as we're seeing with our new restoration sites, they explode when they start growing. They just, they get huge really fast. So we were looking at some of the plants that were, some of our tech plants that were only about 4 years old, 3-4 years old. They're just as big as any of the wiregrass, the wiregrass bunches that are in, our other sites. And once, if you haven't followed the plant from the start, from where it got started, it's really difficult to tell. We've had, discussions with so many different people. What is an actual plant? What's an individual wiregrass plant? Because as they grow, they kind of break up. They don't necessarily maintain that one unit bunch continually forever. So, portions of it die and fragment. And if you're coming in on the scene years down the road, you don't know which piece is, an original one, which one's a new one, which are related. I wish I could tell you, but we know that it's very hard to kill them unless you dig them up or dump herbicide on them or something, or burn them maybe extremely hot. They can live for a really long time.
Larry Mullins says, nice presentation.
Thank you.
And Eugene Kelly asks, do lovegrass and some of the andropogons also play an important role in carrying fire?
Yes, we have andropogon in some of our study sites. So I specifically do not look at like specific aspects of, for example, the andropogon life cycle as much as what we do for wiregrass or dropseed. But definitely present in our site. And one of the things that I actually think it's very interesting from some of the experiment that we spoke about earlier, specifically I'm referring to the community one, where we looked at different plant species, whether they were growing in the proximity of wiregrass or dropseed. We found an andropogon species that was growing usually in the proximity of wiregrass, and I don't think we find any in the proximity of dropseed. So I think this is very interesting, and I'm reconnecting to like the function of the andropogon, because they both carry fire. And one of the things we would be very interested in our lab is looking at how, for example, different grasses carry fire in pine savannas. So even the fact that they often grow together in the proximity of each other could potentially also affect their functions, right? But yeah, I mean, I'm also not really answering any question. I'm just here speculating and say what would be really cool exploring for my research, and yeah, what we want to do in the future. But yeah.
I will say that for andropogon, and anyone here who's been on prescribed fires or in this seen it burn, especially like broom sedge, I feel like it can be, for lack of a better term, like bipolar. You know, sometimes it just won't burn. Like I mean, it will, but it's, you know, it'll kind of half burn and then flop over, and that will be it. Other times I've seen the fire just rip through it. So I because of it has such a different structure to wiregrass and dropseed, I think it's a little, I think it will, and I mean, I haven't done any experiments on this, but I'd imagine that the drying time, the time it takes for the fuel to dry out is longer than wiregrass or dropseed, because you look at those skinny wiry leaves that that wiregrass has compared to a relatively thicker andropogon stem. But I mean, they do burn, they do burn, but it's almost like there's kind of a delay there.
Yeah, I mean, as a person who's, you know, burned different ecosystems myself,
Yeah,
you know, different Bluestems have definitely gone up in my presence, you know.
Yeah.
And so they're definitely carrying fire.
right.
But yeah, they all have thicker blades. I mean, think like creeping Bluestem. I mean, creeping Bluestem is like, you know, that whole clump has to be pretty dried out before it's gonna go. But once it goes,
yeah, it's true. It's true. There's like relatively more fuel there once it is dry. Yeah.
You know, like a lot of those Bluestems have the, you know, the leaves that kind of go like curly, and it's growing for a couple of years.
Curly stuff.
Yeah.
I love that stuff.
I love that stuff. Okay, Brian Silverman asks, I may have missed it, but how long does it take after germination or planting until wiregrass is receptive to fire?
So Carol, correct me if I'm not remembering. I believe they say to wait 2 years. So don't burn it the year after you've planted it, wait 2 years. And that's what they've done at our restoration sites. Yeah. And I think it's just because they're still relatively small. You just want to give them that extra edge. But, you know, no, I haven't heard anybody say, oh, we burned it, you know, 2 years after we planted it and all of them died. I have not heard that. And all of our plants are doing fine. So
I mean, his question is like receptive. So, right, they might burn, but they might, you know, die if you burn them right after you plant them.
Right. So that picture where we showed that field where I was talking about young plants germinating, you can see in that bigger picture, Those little green blades, that's wiregrass. Like what? They planted it in the fall. I think they planted it in like December, and that must have been in like February. So, within 3 months, I don't remember. It was just a few months. So that's like after a few months, the seeds are already, but germinating, but that, that's too sparse to carry a fire per se. If you had a location that was, just like that. Now there are other fuels. So, if you had little wiregrass plants establishing in an area, yeah, and there's other fuels to carry the fire, yeah, they'll burn, but I don't know, if they need maybe 6 months to be able to survive something.
Yeah, because I would say they need like some time to build their below ground before being able to really resprout. So yeah, we give them some time. But
Okay, and Eugene Kelly asks, I read recently that Indian grass flowers most profusely the 3rd year after fire, right? So taller, the leaves come off the stem a little bit higher. They kind of have smaller bunches, and then they kind of make like a little field of Indian grass. Okay, flowers most profusely the 3rd year after fire. So fire frequency should vary a bit from the absolute 2-year cycle, or Indian grass would gradually decline. Is this true?
Right. Do you want to comment, Carol? I feel like I've been taking all the questions.
No, it's okay. Like, I just want to say that, and again, I'm sure that Jen is going to jump in on that, so we can just keep the conversation going on this one. But it's really important, the like pyrodiversity, because I think especially for like plant reproduction, for example, what we've seen from wiregrass is that it's true that it typically flowers more when plants are burned, like in spring or summer, but there are other plants that may be favored by burn, for example, in different seasons or at various fire interval. So what I've seen personally is that there is no one season or one interval that promotes all the plants. So as long as you have a range of fire intervals, you should be able to kind of promote like reproduction in different plant species. But yeah, Jen, I'm sure you have more to add to this.
Well, yeah, it's the same. Yeah, like what Carol said, exactly, it depends on what you're trying to go for. So say here, in a restoration site where they're specifically trying to target wiregrass, they're going to do whatever fire regime they need to promote wiregrass. They're talking about one species. If you want to promote everything, it's trickier. And, yeah, kind of the general, like, throw up your hands and be like, okay, I will just do a mix of like season, frequency, you name it, to try to get everybody happy and promote everybody. We have a student in our lab. She just graduated a master's. Some of you may know her, Mary Nell Armstrong. I believe, I don't know what stages it's in right now, but she did her thesis on that idea of if you burn at these different times of year. So it was specifically season. I don't think it was frequency necessarily, but she did this over 2 years. So areas were burned, and she went back the year of the fire and the year after the fire to see who's flowering, how much are they flowering, how much seed are they producing. And so, yeah, I don't know where, we might post it on our blog maybe when it comes out, her results, which were really interesting. And she found just that, it wasn't just one answer. If you wanted to promote different things, you just kind of, if you know about their biology and their ecology, you can kind of fine tune how you're burning an area or how you're managing an area. So yeah, absolutely. There's not a good or bad, strict yes or no answer for everything.
And I mean, if you look at Florida burn managers, right? I mean, our state agencies are generally underfunded, right? So underfunding means not enough people, right?
Yep.
Maybe not enough equipment, but mostly not enough people. And so you need a certain number of people in order to be able to, get a burn together, right? You get texts all the night before, are you available? Right. And if you can't cobble together the people, what normally happens from what I've seen is just places just don't get burned as often as they really, as the managers would like to. And so a lot of managers, they're still trying, they have to burn within their prescription. They can't do anything dangerous. And we have all this wildlife urban interface issues. And so a lot of managers that I've talked to are trying to do more mosaic burns on the areas that they do burn. So there's some sort of variety.
Yeah, exactly.
Within the unit.
Yeah, that's really important. And like, as you said, it's really important to just get fire on the ground. So yeah, even I think Jen and I recently had like this discussion. We were like presenting, I don't remember what it was, but yeah, we were talking about like some, I think, land managers that were pretty concerned about not burning, for example, during the spring or summer, because we were talking about wiregrass. And yeah, we were saying exactly that, like try to, bring fire on the ground, especially because like if one year maybe you can't burn in spring or summer, but you can just burn in winter. At the same time, you're still, for example, removing fuel and removing all the pine needles that can, suffocate your grasses in the understory. So like, it's still very important.
Let's see. Okay, question, Clara Mullins. Should we or should we not recommend residents plant wiregrass for their yards or properties because of the need for burning?
Oh, you mean you don't want your yard to go up in flames, basically?
I mean,
or you do want your yard to go up in flames.
Yeah, if it's us, we may say we want our yard
to
burn, but yeah. I don't want this responsibility. I'm not.
Yeah, I know. I didn't say anything.
No. No. Do what you want, people.
Right. Yeah. Hey, we gave you the information. This is what we know. So, you're informed.
Wiregrass burns. What are you gonna do?
Yeah. Right.
Yeah. But please just don't plant like those invasive pasture grasses. That just don't do that. Like, don't plant.
Oh my God, yeah.
Everywhere. Yeah.
I think I do know somebody who, a botanist who has been kind of like redoing his yard with native plants. It's funny because we always talk about that, right? Like, oh, like put native plants around your house. And so it's like, okay, well, I have this nice garden. And it's like, yeah, that's great. But like he literally, his yard, I mean, it's got to be wiregrass that he has in his yard. And he's planting all these other pine savanna. He's in the panhandle and planting all these other like, savanna plants in his yard. And it looks really cool because you come up on a house and you're used to seeing, I'm used to seeing all this stuff, in a very defined, I am going to this nature area to go look at this. But like coming up on someone's house and just seeing that right in their yard was really, really cool. So it's not impossible.
Yeah, whenever so for these, I've done a couple of like pre-filming the lunch and learns, and I go to the houses, so it's very easy to know which house I'm going. I just turn off Google Maps like when I get into the neighborhood because it's the only house.
You can tell.
Oh yeah.
Oh, yep, that's it. Okay.
That's great. That's really cool.
Okay, let's see. Are the lupines and the blazing stars in your wiregrass samples?
Oh, the seeds.
In your maybe in your sampling area squares?
Oh, yeah.
We definitely have a couple of sites that are full of blazing stars. Yeah.
Or do you remember, Carol, if either of those was associated with one or the other?
No, I don't think so. So the plants that we found like specifically associated with one or the other, we had the andropogon species that was associated with wiregrass, and then there were some sedges and a vaccinium, so a blueberry that predominantly happened to be found in the proximity of dropseed. But yeah, I don't recall these other species to be predominantly associated with one or the other.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, the one it's Austin Carey, the annual
Yeah.
site, the annual summer site, like in the fall, it's purple.
Yeah, it's beautiful.
It's
And
amazing.
yeah, and I particularly love the blazing star because in the sites, I don't know if it's like that everywhere, but like in the sites that Jen was mentioning, we also have a lot of lynx spiders that are always hunting on the blazing stars.
Yeah.
And it's actually, I don't know, for me, it's very interesting just observing them and see like what they do when they change colors, when the flower change color is super interesting.
Those spiders are really hard to get a picture of. They know you're taking their picture. Like you go at them and they just turn around.
Yeah.
God. I know.
Yeah. So when I was doing BioBlitz, and we had like a Liatris and Carphophorus field, and it was at night, and it was those Synchlora caterpillars had literally taken all of the stamens from the Carphophorus and like decorated itself.
Oh my gosh.
And with the flash, it was like, you know, green and purple highlights with the, it was so cool.
Lightsabers. That's so cool.
Okay, back to serious questions. Rory asks about how does harvesting pine needles affect burn cycles?
That's an interesting question. I guess the first thing that comes to my mind is, you know, where are you harvesting pine needles? So that's already going to kind of give an idea of what the structure is. So I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, I think pine needle harvesting happens in locations where people like, that's what those like pine stands are for, harvesting the pine needles, or at least that is like a primary function. So typically the pines are really dense in those stands. And so there isn't like, there's a lot of pine needles, but there isn't really a whole lot of other stuff like other grasses or forbs. So I guess, you know, in terms of, you know, a natural fire cycle, I don't really know. It would be hard to say because that's the primary function is like getting those pine needles. There isn't going to be a whole lot else on the, I guess I would call it a forest. Here we go, like a forest floor. And so I guess my answer would be that it would be hard to burn if you removed the needles because there wouldn't be that much fuel. So if you wanted to burn that, you would, you know, have to somehow encourage the grasses to come, which might mean thinning it, or like, because I have seen, like, there have been areas with loads of pine needles and they burn. It's more of a slow, like creeping fire because there's just not a lot of oxygen, and the needles just burn for a while.
So can I add?
Yeah, go ahead.
Because I especially like Jen studies fire, I don't know how many years, and I started studying fire just when I came here in the United States. So there were a lot of things that for me were not as obvious. So for example, before coming here, I actually thought that pine needles were, I don't know, promoting fire and they were extremely flammable. Instead, when I really started studying fire, I realized, that it's not the same. So if there is somebody like me that, you know, when I came here was not very aware of these things. I just wanted to say that, for example, in pine savannas, we have like the grasses that burn really well. They're extremely flammable. Yeah, especially some grasses, like I think Jen was saying earlier when she was talking about the difference between the like dropseed and the andropogon. And then you have those pine needles that are like compact and keep humidity high and you know, limit the amount of oxygen so they burn more slowly. I just wanted to say it because that's something that if I didn't study these things, I honestly wouldn't have known. So
right, but you know, with both, you know, then it's, you know, the needles catch on the grass, and so you have the needles burning and the grass burning litter, and it all functions together. But it's like, Carol, when you only, like you, as you said, you know, if you only have pine needles, it burns very differently than if you have grass, and pine needles. So exactly.
Yes, there's no one like waltzing into, you know, Austin Carry National Forest with like a rake and just like taking a bag full of pine needles from like
Oh,
the Savannas, you know.
We did. We didn't do that, but we did go out with a rake to one of the sites. We just wanted like some pine needles, and we were like kind of going in a like no rake. You just had to go and like grab pine needles with your hands. Yeah, because there weren't even like that many of them. So.
But yeah, so like a commercial pine plantation, they're probably, they're maximizing their pine needle harvest, right? And so they're
Right.
just like a layer of pine needles on the ground, and then they're coming through with a little thing to pick it up. Maybe
Yeah.
people. I mean, but anyways, it does not look anything like your experimental sites.
Yeah. Very, very different.
Really different. Okay. Let's see. Ooh. Oh yes, I think we should. This point from Michael Adler, he's saying that if you're having a yard and you're planting all the savanna type plants, right, you're probably going to be battling a lot of weedy stuff. So it's not like you're just going to like rewild your yard and like, you're just going to have like dog fennel, Biden's alba, right?
Well, yeah, when you start out, right. Yeah. If you're like disturbing the soil and like moving things around, yeah, you're going to have to start with that. But Ray Crandall has been studying dog fennel for a while. And what she's finding is that, just after a few years, it starts to go away on its own. So, you might not have like the prettiest yard. I mean, as long as you don't have like invasives and those.
Right. I mean, you could have lots of invasive. You could have long grasses. You could.
Yep, exactly. Yeah. So it's not a lovely, like easy process.
You're just not gonna like plant 5 wiregrasses and then light your lawn on fire once a year. It's not
I wish it was that easy. Yeah.
Too bad.
I know. It's very nice that wiregrass does grow fast, so you don't have to wait like years and years for it to, to start taking over. But yeah, you do have to keep stuff out. That's actually one of the things that we're going to be looking at in our new experiment is, so you throw all the seeds out there. How important is it that you keep other weedy plants out? Does wiregrass do better? Does it grow faster? Does it survive? Is it stronger, healthier, whatever? If you are keeping other weedy plants out. So I think wiregrass is pretty competitive from what we've seen. It doesn't. I've seen pines growing in the middle of wiregrass bunch, and I'm like, who's gonna win? Like I couldn't. It looked like you'd go up to it and you're like, wait, is this a pine? This looks like a pine, but it also looks like a grass down there. So, but I mean, the wiregrass was still alive. I don't know how that works. I couldn't tell you, but yeah. So that's one of the things we'll look at is how important is it? How does the process go if you have other weedy plants or not? Will wiregrass just kind of, fight them off, or yeah, we'll see.
Cool. Michael would like to sort of shot back. He says, the restoration areas at Flamingo Hammock have been going for decades and are still overrun with Bidens and ambrosia over many burn cycles.
Oh dear.
So
I don't know. With the wiregrass just is not. What does the wiregrass look like in those sites? Is it still there? I'd be curious.
I don't know, Michael. We should have him on a lunch and learn. He's
really hey, next one. Right. That would be interesting.
He's done a lot of work. He's a good burner.
Yeah, that'd be great. Hey, that's what our Wiregrass blog is for. Share what you know. Share what you've seen. We kind of envision it as hopefully a central-ish location for that kind of stuff. Right now, I feel like I'm constantly going into Google and being like, which email did I get that story in? Who told me what? But if it's all kind of compiled in one area, it would be a really great resource for anyone to just go in and, once we figure out how to organize it, people can kind of go in and they have contacts if people want to share their contact information. Otherwise, a lot of that just doesn't get out. And then people don't know, and we end up trying to reinvent the wheel, or
Yeah, and I think it's like very important also for developing like our research, and our research question is so interesting because yeah, as we were mentioning, like for example, the experiment testing wiregrass from different soil types, like whether they're more wet or more dry. That's something that I think it mainly came up because usually, again, in restoration, we say it's more important to source wiregrass from like a similar site. So that then opened a series of like super interesting research questions that yeah, they just originated from like talking with managers and landowners. So yeah, it's so important, and it's mainly Ray and Jen doing this blog, but I'm super excited because yeah, it's just gonna be a collection that is not just gonna be scientific research. Obviously, we're gonna be extremely clear about what is, what is being originated from like our experiment and what instead, for example, we're testing or people are saying. But I think it's really important to also kind of gather the knowledge.
Yeah, anecdotal knowledge is amazing, really amazing.
Yes, he says he's trying to remember how the wiregrass is, but he's not remembering right now, but he says his lopsided Indian grass is looking great.
Awesome. I'm glad that's going well. I love Indian grass. That's fantastic.
Well, thank you guys for coming on and sharing your research.
Well, thank you for having us.
Thank you so much. Yeah, this was really fun. Really enjoyed it.
And so you both are grad students, right?
Postdocs.
Oh no,
Postdocs.
we're both
Postdocs.
Yeah.
Okay.
Mhm.
All right. So what's like next steps for you guys? You're gonna teach, I guess.
That's the question that you should never ask to a postdoc.
Sorry.
No, it's okay. The answer is I don't know, maybe we can answer you in a few months, probably, right?
People ask me, they're like, so do you have a real job? It's like people don't really know what postdocs do, and it's typically it's a training period, right? Like it's a job. Like you work and you do research, you put out publications, you teach. It's kind of that, like post PhD period of time where you're not a faculty, but you're still doing a lot of functions or similar to that. So yeah, next steps kind of for postdocs aren't really well defined necessarily. So it's, it's kind of cool in one sense, kind of scary in another, but we all get to that point, I guess. Yeah. So yeah.
Jean says, thank you. Grasses are so important and underappreciated.
Yeah, that's true. They're definitely
underplanted and underappreciated.
Yes.
And I mean, underappreciated in their natural settings. I mean, like I like we did like a bunch of split oak bio blitzes, and Piptachedium wasn't on the plant list. Piptachedium. I mean, like the only like spring flowering. It's gorgeous, it's tall. Woo, like the big long things, not on the plant list. And I was like, I've never seen that before. After going out there for like 2 years.
Yeah.
I mean, people just don't notice these things, including me, employees of the Florida Native Plant Society. So, yeah.
Well, yeah. And even the concept of grass producing flowers. When I was an undergrad, and it's like, don't you know that even when you're like a young kid? No, I never really thought about that. Sorry. Somehow I made it to college without realizing that, grasses make flowers. Flowers aren't just the big blooms. So it's been a very cool journey for me.
Well, thank you for sharing. And I mean, if you go, I'm sure you guys are going to go do exciting things, but if you do exciting plant related things, I would love to have you guys back on individually.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much. Yeah.
Together. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you.
All right.
I guess we'll let everybody go. You guys have a fantastic weekend. Everybody out there, have a fantastic weekend. Become a member of the Florida Native Plant Society.
Yes.
FNPS.org. And then click join now. Yes, it's very important.
Great.